Step into one of the most powerful faith journeys ever told, where uncertainty meets trust and fear gives way to hope. This cinematic narration explores the life of Abraham and the timeless teachings of Jesus Christ, revealing what it truly means to trust God without knowing the future. If you are standing at a crossroads, waiting for answers, or struggling to believe when the path ahead feels unclear, this story will speak directly to your heart and remind you that faith often begins where certainty ends. Abraham, trusting God without knowing the future, is not just an ancient story, it is a mirror held up to every human heart that has ever stood at the edge of uncertainty and wondered whether to step forward or stay where it feels safe. And as this story unfolds, imagine a world without maps, without GPS, without social security, without guarantees. A world where the night sky is the only calendar and faith is the only currency, because that is the world in which Abraham lived, a man who did not begin his journey as a flawless hero but as an ordinary person with fears, attachments, doubts, and a quiet restlessness that whispered there must be more than the life he was living. And it all begins with a voice that does not explain itself, a call that does not offer a detailed plan, only a promise and an invitation to trust. Picture Abraham in the land of Ur, one of the most advanced cities of the ancient world, with structured society, trade routes, temples, security, and predictability. And now let a question rise in your mind: how many people would willingly leave stability for uncertainty, comfort for wandering, familiarity for the unknown? And yet this is precisely what makes Abraham's story so unsettling and so powerful, because God does not say where exactly he will go, how long it will take, what dangers he will face, or how everything will turn out. Instead, the call is simple and terrifying at the same time: go, leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And notice the wording carefully: not the land I have shown you, not the land I will describe to you, but the land I will show you, meaning clarity comes after obedience, not before. This is where the story quietly confronts modern thinking, because today we are trained to ask for details first, outcomes first, benefits first, and then decide whether we will commit. Yet Abraham moves in the opposite direction: he commits first and understands later. And this reversal is the heartbeat of faith, the idea that trust is not built on full information but on relationship. And here comes one of the most surprising truths that often goes unnoticed: archaeology and ancient records suggest that leaving Ur was not a small step of faith but an enormous social and economic risk, because land ownership, family ties, and local gods were deeply intertwined. Leaving meant losing protection, inheritance, and identity. And Abraham accepts all of this loss without knowing what he will gain, except for a promise spoken by an unseen God. As Abraham journeys, the story does not magically become easier. There are no constant miracles lighting the road. There is hunger, there is fear, there are wrong decisions, and even moments where Abraham's faith seems to crack, like when famine drives him to Egypt and fear drives him to lie about Sarah, reminding us that faith does not mean perfection, it means persistence. And this detail matters deeply because it dismantles the false idea that trusting God removes human weakness. Instead, the story shows that God's faithfulness often carries us even when our faith stumbles. Now imagine the silence: years passing with no visible fulfillment of the promise, no land officially owned, no child born to carry the promise forward, only tents, dust, and questions echoing under the stars. And it is here that one of the most cinematic moments in all of Scripture unfolds. God takes Abraham outside and tells him to look up, to count the stars if he can. And then comes the promise that his descendants will be as numerous as those stars. And here is a fascinating insight. Ancient people believed the stars represented destiny, that the heavens controlled fate, yet God flips this worldview by saying Abraham's future will not be ruled by the stars. Instead, the stars will be the symbol of what God will do through him, meaning faith redefines destiny itself. Abraham believes, and the text says this belief is credited to him as righteousness, not because he did something impressive, not because he achieved something great, but because he trusted, and this single moment becomes a cornerstone for faith traditions across centuries, because it reveals that at the core of a relationship with God is not performance but trust, and yet even then, the waiting continues, years turn into decades. Hope rises and falls, and Sarah's laughter of disbelief gives birth to one of the most human moments in the story, because laughter here is not joy but skepticism, the kind that says, "Life has taught me not to expect miracles anymore." Then comes Isaac, the child of promise, born not as a reward for perfect faith but as a gift of grace, and just when the story seems to settle into joy, it takes a turn so shocking that it still unsettles readers today. God asks Abraham to offer Isaac, and at this point, every listener feels the tension tighten, because this request seems to contradict everything God promised, and this is where trust is no longer theoretical. It becomes painfully practical, because Abraham is forced to choose between the promise and the promiser, between what God gave and God himself. As Abraham walks up the mountain with Isaac, the silence is heavier than words, and when Isaac asks where the lamb is, Abraham answers with a line that echoes through history, "God will provide." And this is not a confident declaration spoken from certainty, it is a statement spoken from the edge of faith. And here is another often overlooked insight. In the ancient world, child sacrifice was tragically common among surrounding cultures, and this moment becomes a defining declaration that the God Abraham follows is not like those gods, because at the crucial moment, God stops Abraham's hand, revealing that he never desired the sacrifice but the trust behind it. The ram caught in the thicket becomes more than a substitute, it becomes a symbol of provision that cannot be seen until obedience carries us far enough to see it, and this pattern repeats throughout human experience. We often ask why God does not show the provision first, and the story quietly answers, because faith is not sight walking ahead, faith is trust walking first. Abraham's life ends without seeing the full fulfillment of the promise. He owns only a burial plot of the land he was promised, his descendants are still few, and yet his story is complete, because faith was never about seeing everything completed in one lifetime, it was about believing that God's faithfulness extends beyond our personal timeline. And this speaks directly to anyone who feels frustrated because their obedience has not yet produced visible results. When this story is echoed centuries later in the teachings of Jesus, the connection becomes clear without needing loud explanation. Jesus speaks repeatedly about leaving, about losing life to find it, about trusting God for daily bread, about seeds growing unseen beneath the soil. And in Abraham we see the blueprint of this teaching lived out long before it was spoken aloud. Because faith that does not know the future is precisely the faith Jesus calls his followers into, a faith that releases control, that walks forward without demanding proof, that believes God's character is trustworthy even when circumstances are confusing. And now the story turns toward us, because Abraham's journey is not preserved merely to be admired, it is preserved to be repeated in countless forms. Every time someone chooses integrity over convenience, purpose over popularity, obedience over applause, they step into Abraham's footsteps, and the question lingers quietly but powerfully, what would your life look like if you trusted God without knowing the future? Not when everything makes sense, but precisely when it does not. There is a reason this story has survived thousands of years, It is because it speaks to the most universal human struggle, the fear of the unknown, and it answers not with detailed plans but with a person, a God who walks with those who trust him, and this is the final, gentle truth that lingers like the last note of a cinematic score. Faith does not eliminate the unknown, it teaches us how to walk through it with courage. And just as Abraham's trust shaped generations he would never meet, your trust today may be shaping futures you cannot yet see, and that is the quiet power of believing before seeing, of walking before knowing, of trusting God without knowing the future. As Abraham continues walking forward into a future that refuses to explain itself, the deeper layers of his journey begin to reveal something far more profound than simple obedience, because trusting God without knowing the future is not a single dramatic decision, it is a lifetime of repeated surrender, a daily choice to wake up in a tent instead of a palace, to live as a pilgrim instead of a settler. And this lifestyle of faith slowly reshapes not only Abraham's direction but his inner world, his identity, and his understanding of God. One of the most striking details in Abraham's life is how ordinary most of his days must have felt: herding livestock, negotiating water rights, settling disputes, moving camp after camp. And this matters because faith is often imagined as something spectacular, yet Abraham's faith was mostly lived out in monotony, in waiting, in unresolved questions, and in long stretches where God seemed silent. And here is a quiet truth many overlook: the Bible records very few moments where God actually speaks to Abraham compared to the decades Abraham lives in between those moments, which means most of his faith was practiced without fresh words, fresh signs, or fresh reassurance, only the memory of a promise and the decision to keep trusting it. Consider how Abraham responds when land disputes arise between his herders and Lot's herders. Instead of asserting dominance as the elder and rightful heir of the promise, he offers Lot first choice of the land, and this decision seems foolish from a worldly perspective, yet it reveals something powerful. Abraham no longer believes his future depends on grabbing the best opportunity, he believes it depends on God. And when someone truly trusts God with the future, generosity becomes easier, because fear no longer controls the heart. Even Abraham's failures tell a deeper story about trust, because when he lies to protect himself, it exposes the tension between faith and fear that exists within every human being, and yet God's promise does not collapse because of Abraham's weakness, which sends a strong message across time. God's plan is sustained by his faithfulness, not by our flawless execution. And this is crucial for anyone who feels disqualified by past mistakes. Abraham's story refuses to support the idea that one failure ends a life of faith. The delay in Isaac's birth stretches hope to its breaking point, and delayed hope has a way of transforming belief from excitement into endurance, because it is easy to trust when the reward feels close, but far harder when years pass and circumstances move in the opposite direction. And yet Abraham keeps naming places, building altars, and calling on God, small acts that declare, "I still believe you are here, even when I do not understand what you are doing." When Isaac finally arrives, joy is mixed with vulnerability, because anything received as a miracle can feel even more fragile, and this sets the emotional stage for the most intense test Abraham will ever face, a test that forces him to confront whether his trust is rooted in the gift or in the giver. And as he climbs the mountain, the silence of God becomes heavier than ever before, because sometimes faith is tested not by hardship alone but by divine silence that offers no emotional comfort, no explanation, and no reassurance. Abraham's willingness to proceed does not mean he understands, it means he chooses to trust God's character when God's commands feel confusing. And this is one of the deepest forms of faith, trusting that God is good even when his instructions seem to contradict his promises. And the moment the ram appears, it forever defines the nature of God Abraham follows, a God who provides instead of exploits, who stops violence instead of demanding it, and who reveals that true worship is rooted in trust, not loss. As Abraham grows old, his life begins to speak louder than his words. His faith becomes legacy, because trust lived consistently leaves an imprint on the next generation. And even though Isaac will have his own struggles and doubts, he inherits a spiritual inheritance shaped by watching a father who walked with God through uncertainty. And this highlights a powerful truth: faith is contagious, not through sermons but through lived example. Abraham dies without seeing nations rise from his lineage, without seeing the full land possessed, without seeing history recognize his name, and yet the measure of his life is not found in visible completion but in faithful participation. And this challenges a culture obsessed with immediate results, reminding us that some of the most meaningful work of God unfolds beyond the horizon of our lifetime. When later generations reflect on Abraham, they do not remember him as a perfect man but as a trusting one, and this distinction matters, because perfection intimidates but trust invites, and through Abraham, faith becomes accessible to ordinary people with ordinary fears, showing that trusting God without knowing the future is not reserved for the fearless but for the willing. The story ultimately presses a quiet, unavoidable question into the heart of every listener. What promises are you holding on to that still feel unfinished? What steps are you afraid to take because the future feels unclear? And what would it look like to move forward anyway, trusting that clarity often follows obedience rather than precedes it? Abraham's life whispers a truth that grows louder with time, that God rarely reveals the entire road at once, not because he wants to confuse us, but because he wants to walk with us. And faith becomes the bridge between where we are and where we are called to be, built not out of certainty but out of trust. And as the final image fades, the desert night once again fills with stars, silent witnesses to a promise that began with one man's yes, reminding us that when we trust God without knowing the future, we step into a story far bigger than ourselves, a story where obedience today becomes hope for generations tomorrow. The teachings of Jesus bring Abraham's story into sharp focus, not by repeating it word for word, but by revealing its deeper meaning and inviting every generation to live the same kind of trust. Because when Jesus Christ speaks about faith, he does not describe it as a theory to be discussed, but as a way of life that steps forward even when the future remains hidden. And this is where Abraham's journey becomes a living illustration of everything Jesus taught. Jesus repeatedly calls people to follow him without first explaining where the path will lead, and this mirrors God's call to Abraham, because when Jesus says follow me, he does not hand out timelines, guarantees, or safety plans. Instead, he invites trust in his presence rather than confidence in predictable outcomes, teaching that faith is not about knowing the destination but about knowing who you are walking with. When Jesus speaks about worry, about anxiety for tomorrow, about the fear of not having enough, he points to birds that do not store up food and flowers that do not labor for beauty, not to promote irresponsibility, but to reveal a deeper truth, that the future is safest when placed in God's hands. And Abraham lived this teaching long before it was spoken, wandering without permanent land, trusting daily provision, believing that God would supply what he could not control. Jesus teaches that those who seek to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for God's sake will find it. And Abraham embodies this paradox perfectly, because he loses familiarity, status, and certainty, yet gains purpose, legacy, and spiritual life. showing that surrender is not the end of life but the doorway to a greater one. One of Jesus' most profound lessons is that faith often grows in hidden places, like a seed buried in the soil, unseen, uncelebrated, and slow. And Abraham's life reflects this truth deeply, because most of his faith was invisible to the world, lived out in tents, altars, and quiet obedience, and yet that hidden faith eventually reshaped history, teaching that what God grows in secrecy can later bless nations. When Jesus speaks of building a house on solid rock rather than shifting sand, he is not merely talking about moral behavior, but about trust placed in God's words even when storms come, and Abraham builds his life on this same foundation, trusting God's promise despite famine, delay, and fear, proving that storms do not destroy faith that is rooted in trust. Perhaps the clearest echo of Abraham's story appears in Jesus' teaching about sacrifice, because while Abraham was asked to surrender his beloved son and discovered that God provides, Jesus goes further and reveals the ultimate heart of God, not a God who demands our children, but a God who gives his own Son, transforming the meaning of sacrifice forever and showing that trust in God is justified because God himself is trustworthy. Jesus teaches that the kingdom of God belongs to those who become like children, not because children understand everything, but because they trust even when they do not, and this childlike trust is the same posture Abraham adopts, believing without full understanding, obeying without full clarity, and walking forward without seeing the end. In the life and words of Jesus, Abraham's faith reaches its fullest expression, because Jesus shows that trusting God without knowing the future is not reckless, it is relational, rooted in the assurance that God is good, present, and faithful. And as Jesus walks toward the cross without certainty of comfort but with complete trust in the Father, he demonstrates the ultimate act of faith, placing the future entirely in God's hands. The teaching of Jesus ultimately invites every listener into the same journey Abraham began, a journey where faith is not measured by how much we know, but by how deeply we trust. And as Jesus promises resurrection beyond the cross, he assures us that surrender never has the final word, and that trusting God with an unknown future always leads to a hope far greater than we could ever imagine. Jesus' teaching does not stop at invitation or explanation, it presses gently but firmly into the inner posture of the heart, because trusting God without knowing the future is not merely about big life decisions, it is about the quiet, daily surrender of control, and Jesus addresses this again and again by shifting attention away from tomorrow and anchoring it firmly in today, teaching that each day has enough trouble of its own and that grace is given one step at a time, not in advance installments, reminding us that faith is sustained moment by moment, not by seeing the whole picture. When Jesus speaks in parables, he often chooses stories where outcomes are hidden at first, a farmer scattering seed not knowing which ground will respond, a servant investing talents without knowing how the master will judge the result, a traveler helping a stranger without knowing the cost. And through these stories Jesus reveals a profound truth: obedience often comes before understanding, and trust often precedes clarity, because faith is not passive waiting but active participation even when results remain uncertain. Jesus also teaches that fear is one of the greatest enemies of faith, not fear of danger alone, but fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of surrender. And Abraham faced these same fears centuries earlier, yet Jesus exposes fear by revealing the character of God as a loving Father, not a distant ruler, teaching that those who trust God are not stepping into randomness but into care, provision, and intentional love, even when the path feels unclear. In moments where Jesus withdraws to pray alone, often at night, often before major decisions or suffering, he models the source of trust, communion with God rather than control over outcomes, and this echoes Abraham's altars in the wilderness, quiet places where trust was renewed not through answers but through presence, teaching that faith is sustained not by explanations but by relationship. As Jesus moves closer to the cross, his teaching becomes embodied reality, because he walks forward knowing suffering awaits, yet without knowing the precise details of how redemption will unfold, and this moment becomes the ultimate revelation of trust, because even when his soul is overwhelmed and his prayers are filled with anguish, he entrusts the future into God's hands, declaring surrender not as weakness but as strength rooted in love. The resurrection then reframes everything Jesus taught about trust, because it reveals that obedience placed in God's hands is never wasted, that surrender is not an ending but a transformation, and that trusting God without knowing the future is justified not because life avoids pain, but because God redeems it, giving meaning beyond what the present moment can explain. Through Jesus' teachings, the call becomes deeply personal, not abstract or distant, because he does not ask people to master faith, but to practice it, to choose trust over anxiety, obedience over fear, and hope over despair, even when the future feels unresolved. And this echoes Abraham's life once more, a life shaped not by certainty but by commitment. And now the teaching reaches beyond history and into the present moment, because the same question that echoed in Abraham's heart and in the crowds listening to Jesus still echoes today. Will you trust God even when the future refuses to reveal itself? Will you walk forward when the path is unclear? Will you release control when holding on feels safer? And in this question lies the essence of Jesus' message. Trust, as Jesus teaches it, is not blindness, it is confidence in God's character, not knowing every answer but knowing the one who holds them, and this trust transforms fear into courage, waiting into purpose, and uncertainty into hope, shaping lives not by predictability but by faithfulness. As the teaching settles, it leaves behind a quiet but powerful assurance that the unknown future is not empty, it is held, and just as Abraham's trust shaped generations and Jesus' trust reshaped eternity, so every act of trust today becomes part of a larger story God is still writing, a story where faith walks first, and understanding follows later, and where trusting God without knowing the future becomes the doorway to a hope that never fades. As everything comes together, Abraham's journey and the teachings of Jesus Christ merge into one powerful message that gently settles into the heart, because both stories are not really about the past, they are about the present moment you are living right now, the decisions you are facing, the uncertainty you are carrying, and the quiet fears you may never say out loud. And in this final reflection, the truth becomes beautifully simple. God has never asked his people to predict the future, only to trust him while walking into it. Abraham teaches us that faith begins when comfort ends, and Jesus teaches us that peace begins when control ends, and together they reveal that the unknown future is not something to be feared, but a place where God's faithfulness is waiting to be discovered, step by step, day by day, breath by breath. Because faith was never meant to give us all the answers, it was meant to give us the courage to keep moving even when the answers are delayed. Jesus shows that trusting God does not mean life will always feel easy, but it will always be meaningful, because meaning is born when love is chosen over fear, obedience over hesitation, and hope over despair. And just like Abraham never saw the full picture yet shaped generations, your trust today may be shaping outcomes you will never fully witness, prayers answered in ways you cannot imagine, lives touched without you ever knowing, and hope planted where darkness once seemed permanent. And now, as this story gently closes, let it leave you not with pressure, but with peace, not with fear of the unknown, but with confidence in the one who holds it, because the sweetest lesson of all is this: God does not reveal the future to prove his power, he walks with us through it to reveal his love, and when you trust him, even imperfectly, even with doubts, even with trembling steps, your journey becomes part of something far bigger than you. If this message stirred your heart, if it reminded you that you are not alone in your waiting, not weak in your questions, and not forgotten in your uncertainty, then let this be more than just a video you watched. Let it be a connection we share, a journey we walk together, and I invite you from the heart, like this video so this message can reach someone who needs hope today. Share it with a soul who may be standing at their own crossroads. And subscribe to this channel so we can continue exploring stories of faith, hope, and courage that speak to real life, real struggles, and real hearts. Stay connected, stay hopeful, and remember this gentle truth as you move forward: you don't need to see the whole road to take the next step, you just need to trust the one who walks beside you, and as long as there is faith, there is always a future worth walking toward. And before we truly close, let this moment slow down, because the deepest messages are never rushed, they settle quietly, like light spreading across the horizon at dawn, and the story of Abraham and the teachings of Jesus Christ leave us with something gentle yet powerful, a reminder that faith is not about being brave all the time. It is about choosing to trust even when your heart feels tired, even when answers feel delayed, even when the future looks unclear. Life will always bring seasons where the road feels uncertain, where prayers feel unanswered, where the silence feels louder than hope. But the beauty of this message is that God has never abandoned anyone in the waiting. Abraham was not forgotten in the desert, the disciples were not abandoned in their confusion, and you are not unseen in your present moment, because faith does not mean walking alone, it means walking accompanied, even when you cannot feel it. There is a sweetness in this truth, a learning that comforts the soul, that God is more interested in your trust than your timeline, more focused on your heart than your certainty, and more committed to your journey than you could ever be to understanding it fully. And when this truth sinks in, anxiety begins to loosen its grip, fear begins to lose its voice, and hope quietly takes its place. So as you step back into your life after this video, carry this with you: you do not need to rush your faith, you do not need to force clarity, and you do not need to compare your journey with anyone else's, because God's timing is personal, his guidance is intentional, and his presence is constant, even when the road ahead looks unfamiliar. If this message brought you peace, strength, or even a small spark of hope, I invite you once again from the heart, support this channel by liking this video, because every like helps this message travel further than we ever could. Share it with someone who might be quietly struggling or standing at a crossroads, and subscribe so we can continue walking together through stories that heal, teach, and inspire faith in everyday life. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and thank you for allowing this space to be more than content, to be connection, learning, and hope. And until we meet again, remember this gentle promise: you don't need to know the future to trust God with it, just take the next step, and let faith light the way.